Good evening and welcome to the Velocity of Now with me, your host, Thomas Sheridan. It's Thursday, the 29th of September. The month is almost over, 2016. This is a pre-recorded show because as you're listening to this, I will be coming back from Switzerland, where I've been over there doing some media work for the book, The Druid Code. So tonight's show is going to be a biggie. I want to give some updates on the Manchester pusher story, and I also want to talk in general about what is it about that part of England that produced serial killers and murders, and in particular one part of Greater Manchester called Hyde, a town called Hyde. My website is www.thomassheridanarts.com, www.streetdruid.net, and this is probably the first time in a while I've gone back to these topics of serial killers and psychopaths and so on, concentrating mainly in recent months on the esoteric and the Fortean and the magical aspects of my work. I thought it'd be a good time to revisit this, as this time of year is the months of the Cali. The harvest don't only take place in the fields, but the harvest also takes place in the psyche. We're heading towards Halloween. It's important to sort of like dredge the dark side up and bring the dark side up. Now, the good news about the Manchester pusher is, well, it seems to have stopped. It doesn't mean it's stopped. But there's definitely been, we can live in hope that the killings of the Manchester pusher have stopped. It's a hard one to say. A number of things could have worked out. Maybe this publicity that I have generated, because the media didn't care, has resulted in the killer stopping and moving on, perhaps, afraid they're going to get caught. That's the most unlikely scenario. A more likely scenario is that the highlighting has actually stopped people from being on the canals alone in the heart of the city centre, walking home alone or meeting up strangers in gay bars and walking with them. And so that would be a good thing if that was the reason why the numbers have stopped and dropped off. Or the police were on the trail, set up extra patrols, and he bunked it. It's happened before. There was another pusher in London in the 1970s who was pushing people under tube trains. And he got away with it, except he boasted about it one day in a police holding cell to another prisoner. Otherwise, the police let him go because, again, it's impossible to catch serial killers, almost impossible. It's only luck that they catch them. And the London police ignored it rather than allowing a public panic. In Manchester, the cops there did the same, and if it wasn't for people like myself and Professor Gray Jackson, the same would have happened. This is why we pissed off the Manchester police so much. But fingers crossed that the Manchester killings have stopped, that the so-called pusher serial killer has stopped. But having said that, tonight's show brings up an interesting thing, that some places are hotspots for producing serial killers. Now, I don't know why. Is it a case of that they're born like this? Is it a case that, as Stephen King said in Salem's Lot, as the lead character said in Salem's Lot, evil places attract evil men. But there's no doubt about it that Manchester has an unfortunate reputation of producing monsters, serial killers, and pretty horrific ones. And remember that Jimmy Savile began his career probably there too as well at the BBC studios in Dickinson Lane, which was a church where he hosted the first Top of the Pops. Now, Manchester is a very large city spread over a greater Manchester area of probably 5 million people. Now, the city was an industrial giant. And as the British industry collapsed after World War II, it fell apart and became like almost like a third world city. It has rebuilt itself and rejuvenated itself since. But there was a period between the 50s and the 80s where it was falling apart. It was a mess. And it missed out on the 60s in the way Liverpool did with the Liverpool beat and all that explosion from the Beatles. And you had the London beat as well. Manchester, the second largest city in England and in the UK, missed out on all this. It just fell apart. And if it probably wasn't for its soccer team, Manchester United, and now Manchester City, it probably wouldn't have had any place on the map other than a place of decay and everything that's wrong with the British government and how it treats regional and how it behaves around regional cities. But for some reason, like the Morrissey song, it did produce great bands later on, of course, with the Smiths, the Stone Roses, New Order and so on, Joy Division. But prior to that, again, great art comes from great suffering and great decay. It's not too dissimilar to what I was saying about London during the Blitz, but it's a slow burn version of that on the previous Sunday's Velocity of Now. Tonight we're going to look into the history of one town, one suburb of Greater Manchester called Hyde, which would probably qualify it, and I don't mean it's any disrespect to people living in Hyde, as probably the serial killer capital of Europe. And there's absolutely nothing remarkable about this place, Hyde, Hyde. Interesting that it's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but anyway. I'm reading an article here that was written a few years back by someone called William Kendall, and I will, in a crime magazine, and I will extrapolate as we read through the text. So the article is called Hyde's History of Murder, the extraordinary concentration of notorious serial killers and multiple murders among the 20th century residents of a small town like Hyde in Greater Manchester is truly remarkable. My name is David Smith. Is this the Hyde police station? There's been a murder. With that phone call, a teenager triggered the investigation that led to the arrest of the Moors murderers Ian Brady and Moira Hindley, Britain's most notorious killers of the 20th century. The caller was Moira Hindley's 17-year-old brother-in-law. He was phoning from a call box in the Hyde suburb of Hattersley, where in Wardlebrook Avenue, Brady and Hindley shared a council house with Moira's grandmother. Hyde's residents could hardly believe what followed that phone call. It seemed incredible that such an evil young couple had apparently lived uneventful lives in their midst, was keeping them to themselves but exchanging cheery hellos with the neighbours on the street, and meanwhile burying other young victims and another up on the moors. Could it be really true? Well, it was. But memories are short. Little more than 30 years later, Hyde's reaction to the case of another multiple murderer in the town was again one of disbelief. Folk ordering flowers to welcome Dr. Harold Shipman back to his home in Mostrom. So confident were they of his acquittal, and in both cases police themselves could not at first believe what they were hearing. When David Smith phoned Hyde police station at 6:07 a.m. on October the 7th, 1965, the constable who took the phone call thought it might be a hoax, and the officer dispatched to the call box had the same suspicion. There was no sign of anyone at the kiosk where Smith had said he would be waiting. Moments later, however, a frightened young couple ran to the police car and from a nearby side road. They were Smith and his wife, Maureen Moira Hindley, 19-year-old sister. That was Moira Hindley's younger sister. At the sound of the approaching footsteps, Smith tried to scramble into the car through the driver's door. It was only two workmen, his wife reassured him. He seemed a bag of nerves, and the policeman saw he was holding something and warily told him to hand it over. Smith passed him a screwdriver and a bread knife, saying that he had them for self-protection. At the police station, he began to tell his story. It sounded almost incredible, but Superintendent Robert Talbot was telephoned, at which he was about to leave on holiday. With a sigh, he told his wife their vacation was postponed for a day. But with luck, he would be back for lunch. He wasn't. He was to have only breakfasts at home for the next 6 weeks. Smith's story seemed no more believable when he repeated it for the superintendent. At 11:40 the previous evening, he said his sister-in-law Moira Hindley had called around to ask his wife to give their mother a message at work the next day. Then Moira had asked him to walk her home as she was scared to do so in the dark. So he had set out with her, telling his wife he'd be back in a few minutes. When he arrived at the house, Moira's grandmother was asleep upstairs in her bedroom, and Brady had a visitor, later identified as Edward Evans, a 17-year-old homosexual whom Brady had picked up in Manchester that evening and brought home for a drink. Smith said he was in the kitchen when he heard a scream, and Moira called, "Dave, help him, help him." He thought the visitor was attacking Brady, so he ran into the sitting room. The visitor was writhing face down on the floor, and Brady was standing over him, beating him with an axe. Smith couldn't believe his eyes. He thought they were play acting, but when he saw the blood and more axe blows following, "It's done," Brady said. "It's the messiest yet. It normally only takes one blow, but we have to get rid of him." The couple's two dogs were barking their heads off, and Smith stood frozen in shock. Brady had often tried to impress him with handguns, his books on sadism, and the talk of robbing banks, but this was something else. Now, what's interesting here is two things. Brady's casual murders of this poor young guy, and also the fact that Moira Hindley, who was a killer herself and was basically involved in helping Brady kill children, was afraid of the dark. You find these kinds of anomalies with psychopaths. They have no problem putting a screwdriver through a child's head, but they'd be afraid to watch a horror film. Or if they cross the street, if there's a car like a mile away, they run across terrified they're going to get hit. It's the kind of animal thing. Moira, a voice called from upstairs. Moira left the bedroom and went to the foot of the stairs. "Okay, Gran," she called back. "It's the dogs. I dropped the tape recorder on my foot." Brady ordered her to clean up, poured Smith a glass of wine, and told him to help her. She balked at scooping up brain tissue off from the carpet, so Brady deftly removed it. "Now, white sheet, blanket, polythene," he ordered, and Moira promptly fetched them. They were apparently ready to hand. With practiced efficiency, the body was wrapped. "Eddie's a dead weight," Brady joked as he began to lift the corpse, and he and Moira laughed. Then Smith helped him to carry the body upstairs, Brady having decided it was too risky to take it out to his car at that time of night. The cleanup completed, Moira brewed tea, and the couple planned the body disposal. See, this is the whole thing with psychopaths. They just murder someone for fun, and then they sit down and have a cup of tea. Just business. Moira recalling a narrow squeak when they were on the moors. Ian was burying the victim, and the policeman came up in the car and asked her, "What's the trouble?" She told him, "I'm waiting for my sparking plugs," and he had driven off. It was 3 a.m. when Smith was at last able to leave, the couple having decided he was to help them smuggle the body out of the house the next evening. Back home, he was violently sick. Then he told his wife what had happened and asked what they should do. "We're going to the police," Maureen said, and they went to the phone. At the police station, his account, with the couple's talk of burying bodies on the moors, seemed fanciful, and Superintendent Talbot took it with more than a pinch of salt, but he could see that Smith was scared stiff of Brady. Sorry for the problems with reading this. It's tiny, tiny print in a faded ancient magazine, so please bear with me. Talbot thanked him for coming forward and prepared to leave the house. "I wouldn't go alone outside, sir," Smith warned him. "He's got guns." Talbot picked up his phone and arranged for 12 uniformed officers, 6 plainclothes men, and a policeman woman to surround the house discreetly. Then he set off with Detective Sergeant Carr. On arriving at the scene, he decided to approach the house from the rear. Conscious of his uniform, he saw a baker's van which had stopped just down the road, and he borrowed the driver's long white baker's coat. Like the superintendent, the bread man was unaware of the role his coat was about to play in the arrest of the two multiple murderers, and he parted with it reluctantly, saying he had some small change left in the pockets. Then, with a basket of bread over his arm, Talbot went and opened the front gate of the house. On the way, he heard a chuckle. In the distance, 2 of the men were enjoying the spectacle spectacle of their chief disguised as a bread man. Never mind. You see, even then, the police in Manchester, a lot of them were idiots. This is like why I had to deal with those idiots when the Pusher stuff came out. I mean, the guy is clearly about to arrest a couple of murderers, dressed as a bread man, and what do the regular coppers do? They giggle and chuckle. No wonder the Pusher got away, if that's the level of policing in Manchester. He walked down the side of the house and knocked on the back door. There was no response, so he knocked again, and the door was opened by Moira. She was smartly dressed and looked like a secretary about to leave for work. Thought the superintendent to himself. He'd like to speak to her husband, he told her. She hadn't got one, she replied. He stepped past her into the kitchen and opened the white coat, revealing his police uniform. Moira didn't seem surprised. Her expression didn't change. Her face remained inscrutable. He followed her from the kitchen to the next room, and Sergeant Carr stepped into the kitchen behind her. In the room, everything looked neat and tidy apart from the bed. Brady was sitting up in it, wearing only a string vest and writing a letter. He looked up at Talbot as he entered, and then continued writing. I understand that last night an act of violence was committed on these premises, the superintendent told the couple. Both remained silent, and Carr appeared in the doorway. I'd like to see you upstairs if you don't mind, Talbot continued. Certainly, said Moira coldly, and led the way. Carr remained in the room, and Brady carried on writing his letter. Reaching the landing, Talbot saw the two doors were closed, and the bathroom door stood open. No, Moira whispered as she grasped on the handle of the closed doors. He inched the door open and saw an elderly woman sitting up in bed, sipping a cup of tea. He closed the door discreetly. It's me gran, said Moira. It's her house and she's not a bit well. Talbot tried the other closed door. It was locked, and he asked for the key. That wasn't convenient, Moira told him. Why not? She kept her firearms there for safety, she said, and the key was in her office. He had to have it, Talbot told her, and returned downstairs to Brady, who looked up from his letter. Now, you see, Brady is this is like the psychopath for you. Brady has just murdered someone in the house. He's writing a letter on the bed. The cops are searching the house. Is there a panic? Is there anything? No, it's just business. He continues to write the letter while the cops are searching the house. Talbot said he'd send an officer to Moira's workplace to pick up the key. There was a moment's silence, then Brady said, You best give him the key. Moira picked up her handbag, produced the key ring, and Talbot followed her upstairs again, hoping that Brady hadn't got a gun under his pillow. The superintendent unlocked the door, stepped into the sparsely furnished room. He opened the wardrobe and saw it contained only shoes and clothes on the hangers. Beneath the window, a neatly wrapped oblong parcel lay on the floor. He bent down and moved his fingers along it. At one end he felt a set of toes. The subsequent events were followed avidly by a horrified public. 2 left luggage tickets found in the house led detectives to 2 suitcases in Manchester Central Railway Station. The cases contained photos of 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey, missing since November 1963. Her voice was on a tape recording found in one of the suitcases. She was asking for her mother and begging to go home. The police also found Brady's notes of his plan to murder 12-year-old John Kilbride, who had disappeared in the same month as Leslie. Photographs depicting Brady and Moira Hindley on the moors enabled the police to find the 2 children buried in a few hundred yards from each other. On the 6th of May 1966, the murderers were jailed for life. The case was sensational, but in one respect it eclipsed that of a hard murder, 13-year-old Ivy Lydia Wood, which made legal history. Her father was a Hyde hairdresser, and on 6:10 on the evening of the 25th of July 1919, he sent Ivy on a 5-minute walk to another hairdresser's shop a quarter of a mile from her Newton Street home to buy him ferrules for his umbrella and a walking stick. When 7:30 came and she hadn't returned, Mr. Woods sent her elderly sister Daisy to look for her. Daisy couldn't find her, and at 8:20 he closed the shop and went to search for Ivy himself. He too was unsuccessful, and at 9:15 he went to the police station and reported Ivy missing. Then he resumed his search, continuing to scour the streets until 2:20 a.m. 5 hours later he was informed that Ivy was dead, and her body was at the police station. At 1:30 a.m. Arthur Beard, the 33-year-old night watchman at the bottom mill of Hyde's Carryfield cotton mills, had gone to a lodge at the top of the mill and told the watchman there, "I'm in a mess." Beard was drunk, and he went on to say that he found a girl in the mill yard near the dining hall, and he thought that she had pegged out. He had carried her to his lodge, he said, and he had asked her, the fellow watchman, to go to the bottom of the lodge while he himself went to find a policeman. "You should not have shifted her," his colleague told her. Pegged out, I'm pretty sure, means he thought she was drunk. Because, the expression, take someone down a peg. They used to have, beer used to be sold in gigantic cups, and there was, each peg was a portion. So you used to drink from peg to peg. So pegged out, I think, is an expression meaning drunk. Shortly afterwards, Beard met a police sergeant in Market Street and told him, "I found the dead body in a girl near the reservoir bank close to the top of Clarendon Road." The sergeant accompanied him to the lodge, where he saw the girl's body lying on a bench. "I carried her from the river bank, and I didn't know what to do with her," Beard told him. "I was going my usual round when I saw something white, and I put my torch on it and saw the body of a young girl on her back." The sergeant noticed that the knees of Beard's trousers were wet and dirty. Beard saw him looking at them and said he had fallen 3 times while carrying the girl. He smelled strongly of alcohol, and when the sergeant asked him about this, Beard said he'd been on the beer during the afternoon. It later transpired that he was also been drinking at the Navigation Hotel that evening when he should have been on duty, and there was nobody at the mill to report his absence because the workers were all on holiday. He had also bought a bottle of whiskey and had taken it back to the mill. The girl was identified as Ivy Wood, and the police surgeon who had examined her body at 3 a.m. found that she had been raped and suffocated, dying before 7 p.m. The doctor also examined Beard's clothes, noting that the knees of his trousers were caked with dirt, and the toe ends of his boots appeared to have been rubbed onto the ground. At 4 a.m., Hyde's chief police constable asked Beard to take him to the spot where he'd found the body, and the inspector accompanied them. There was no sign that either the girl or Beard had been on the spot, and the chief constable told Beard that he did not believe that he found the body there. "It must have been thrown over the wall," Beard replied, but the chief constable thought that was impossible. Asked again to account for the dirt on his knees, Beard said, "I had to go up to the embankment to see the water in the reservoir, and I fell in the clay." The chief constable pointed out that there was no footprints to substantiate this, and Beard made no reply. After being taken back to the police station, Beard made a statement to Detective Chief Inspector Arthur Neal, who he admitted that he had not found Ivy Wood on the bank by the dining hall, and continued, "The girl was a stranger to me. I was coming from the fire hole towards the lodge when I saw her and spoke to her. I asked her what was she doing there. She said she'd come to look around. It was about 6:30. I said, 'I will take you around.' And we went to the fire hole first. I think I asked her to give me a kiss or something like that, and she started to run away towards the lodge. I caught hold of her and tried to get one. I took her to a room where the pump is. We had a bit of a struggle, and then I seemed to lose my senses. I got down and she seemed to get unconscious. He said he went back to the lodge. A friend had called to see him, and they drank some whiskey from the bottle he had bought lunchtime. He then accompanied his friend to the Navigation Hotel. I had several drinks there, and I think I stayed there until closing time. I hardly knew what to do." And he went on to say, "I didn't know whether I went home or not. I don't know what became of me. When I came to my senses, I was in the lodge. I believed I had slept there. It was about 1 o'clock or 1:30 when I woke up. The fire in the lodge had gone out. I then went to the fire hall to carry on my work. I went to the room where the pump is and saw the girl lying there. I picked her up. She was stiff. I carried her into the lodge and I laid her out on the desk." Then he went to the other watchman for assistance. He said, "I went out and fetched the police while he waited outside the lodge. I should not I should have not injured the girl in any way. If I had not been sodden and mad with drink, it was the whiskey that put me the finishing touches to it. After Beard was convicted of Ivory Wood's murder at his trial in Chester Anisis, but the Court of Criminal's Appeal reduced the verdict to manslaughter on the grounds that he was drunk at the time of the assault and he was incapable of acting with malice or forethought. This was challenged by the Crown, and the judgment was overturned again when the case went to the House of Lords. The Lord Chancellor ruled that although Beard might have been too drunk to form an intention to kill, he was able to form the intention to commit the felony of rape, in the furtherance of which he used violence. His murder conviction was subsequently restored, but he knew he would not go to the gallows. The Home Secretary had intimidated that whatever the outcome of the legal argument, he would recommend a reprieve, and the Lord Chancellor the earlier announced that whatever the Lords ruled, Beard would not be executed. Ivywood had bought the ferals for her father. The mill was on her route home, and a witness had seen her go through the gates. There was no evidence that Beard had lured her, and she probably went in simply out of curiosity, expecting to find the mill deserted because it was a day of the workers' annual picnic trip to Blackpool. Ironically, if Beard had have deserted his post earlier and had it been in the pub when the arrivee arrived, or if he had not already been drunk senseless, she would have walked through the mill gates unscathed. 11 months after Ivy's murder, Hyde residents were shocked by another. The victim was Mr. Ada Eller, who back in March 1918 had been expecting a child by her second husband James when he sent her a disturbing letter. He was serving in the army and had been gassed and wounded in the action, and he wrote to say that he was in love with another woman and that she too was pregnant. A few days later he wrote again, claiming he hadn't written the previous letter, and he asked Ada to burn it. She told him she had destroyed it, but she kept it with an eye to the future. James Eller was both violent and a heavy drinker, and on March 25, 1920, Ada applied for a separation order on the grounds of persistent cruelty. The same day she moved out of the house with the two of her children to a house in Hyde's Tabot Street. Her 33-year-old husband soon discovered where she had gone, and 2 days after her departure he went there and begged her to return to him. She refused, and 5 hours later he approached a policeman in Market Street saying that he had just murdered his wife, Eleanor told him. As the officer was taking him to the police station, Eller posed at a sweet stall, bought some mint drops and told the stallholder, "I've done a murder." Just think about that. I mean, there we go again. He just stopped for a second after murdering his woman, stops and buys some sweets, and then says, "Oh, by the way, I've murdered someone." This is the psychopaths. Where the previous guy, Beard, was just probably a pathetic alcoholic who probably didn't mean to murder the girl. And that's probably why he didn't get the death penalty. But this is quite different. When they have their senses about them, it's completely different. It's just business. At his trial at Chester Anisis, he claimed that he didn't know what he was doing when he killed Ada. She had told him to go and put his head on the railway line, he said, and he had lost his self-control and battered her to death with a hammer. See, what? The hammer again. This is like Savile, women are brain damaged, Sutcliffe. His wartime gassing still affected him. He told the court he'd heard strange voices and often didn't know what he was doing. And now we see this is getting interesting. But while on remand, he had discussed this case with a fellow prisoner who testified that Eller was faking insanity. Classic psychopath tactic. The jury thought so too, and they found him guilty of murder, and he was hanged in Liverpool on August 11, 1920. A golf course was the scene of Hyde's next murder. This is incredible. We're talking about a small, like a town here. Next murder, on September 10th, 1936, Arthur Crowley, that's a good one, Crowley, was crossing the Godley Links just outside the town on his way to Wald's ice cream factory, where he worked. He was using a public footpath across the course when he saw at first what he thought was a pile of old clothes. Closer inspection revealed to be the body of a girl lying face upwards on the grass. She appeared to be dead, and Crowley ran to the ice cream factory and phoned for the police. On arriving at the scene shortly afterwards, Detective Sergeant Bradbury noted that the girl was fully dressed. Her face seemed composed, and there was no obvious marks or violence. Her handbag was unopened and her purse was intact, but trampled grass on the girl's right side indicated a struggle. Although she was fully dressed, her underwear was torn and disarranged. Her coat appeared to have been wrapped around her after death, and her hat placed on top. A matchbox, a man's handkerchief, and several spent matches lay near the head, suggesting that someone had examined her to see whether she was dead or alive. The body was taken to the mortuary at Hyde Police Station, where detectives were discussing the case when a tearful Miss Elizabeth Walsh arrived to report her 17-year-old daughter Kathleen missing from their home at Holland Road. Showing the body of a girl she found on the golf course, she identified that of her daughter Kathleen. Mrs. Walsh went on to say she had no doubt who was responsible for her daughter's death. For the past 11 months, she told detectives Kathleen had been courted by a Joseph Barber, a 26-year-old ex-sailor who lived in Field Street, and she had failed to return home after going on a previous evening with Barber, whom she said was rejoining the Navy the next day. Mrs. Walsh said about a fortnight ago she had noticed a cooling off in the couple's relationship. Then Barber had told her Kathleen had broken it off with me and won't walk with me anymore. He said he couldn't sleep for thinking about her and he was returning to the Navy. He had kept waylaying Kathleen and she made her way home from work, asking her to go with him, and to mollify him, Kathleen had agreed to see him each evening during those days and remained before he said he was due back to sea. Conducting an autopsy, Dr. James Hamilton concluded Kathleen had died from a combination of suffocation and shock on being violently raped. The handkerchief found at the scene, he believed, might have been applied to her mouth to stifle her screams. Barber had not returned home and the police launched a search for him, issuing a description for him on his bicycle. Then at 6:45 p.m. on the day Kathleen's body was found, two policemen saw a man matching Barber's description enter the Crescent Inn at the village of Broadbottom. I followed him in, one of the constables was later to say. He was in a room in the table reading a newspaper and had a glass of what appeared to be beer in front of him. I told him we were police officers and we asked him his name and he calmly replied, Joe Barber. I told him I was going to detain him because if the Hyde police wished to interview him. He was not told what it was about, but at one snap, I have nothing to say. He never asked me why we were arresting him. See, again, he knew. They don't care. This is like the psychopath. I mean, there's a photograph of Joe Barber here, and he has that I've noticed that a lot of these evil men, these evil little maggots, they don't have features on their faces. I've noticed that with some of the stalkers and some of the lunatics on Facebook that I've had to deal with, the male ones. There's a complete lack of facial feature. They look like badly drawn cartoons. And I've noticed this with a lot of the sex killers or the violent sex killers, is that there's a face that doesn't really have any character about them. It's almost like they have a face of androgyny and they become stalkers and sex freaks because there's something inside them that is not fully energetically resolved within this reality. And your man Barber in his photograph looks just like that. He'd never make an actor. He looks like a face that's been sanded down to basic cartoon features. You would not recognize him in a crowd if you had to do an identity kit of him and describe his features. You couldn't. There's a blankness there. There's a blankness. At Hyde Police Station, Sergeant Bradbury told Barber he was making inquiries about the girl's body found in Godley Golf Course that morning. Yeah, I know what it is, Barber replied, but I did not take her there with that intention. The police had learned that Kathleen had been seeing another sailor, Harold Schofield, who said he had got to know him while he was at home from leave in August. He had gone out with her on her 17th birthday and again 2 days later on August 20th. That evening I saw her at home, he said. When I was leaving, Barber came up and said to me, I have been going out with Kathleen for a long while. You keep away from her. Then he challenged me to a fight. They had not fought. You see, this guy Barber was a coward. This other guy who was moving in on her, this guy Schofield, had said, okay, let's solve this like men. But the blank-faced Barber couldn't fight. You could only murder and rape women. They had not fought, however, and Schofield told the police. I returned to the barracks at Davenport the next day. Afterwards, I wrote a letter to Kathleen, and she wrote to me. I liked her very much and intended going with her when I came home again. Barber did not deny being jealous of him, but insisted the feelings were not strong enough to make him want to kill Kathleen. Charged with her murder, he made a statement in which he said that on being discharged from serving in the Royal Navy, he had 7 years. He had met Kathleen on his return in Hyde in 1935. They had walked out together for several weeks, and I had not given her the same affections as previously. I did not go to her home as regularly, and was often late in turning up. I had seen too much of her. When he took her out for a walk again on the evening of September 9th, his statement continued. We sat down on the golf links talking. I asked her why she had been out with another sailor called Schofield. She told me she did it because I was not paying her the same attention as I had been. I was jealous. She taunted me, I remember. I got hold of her and things went black. I do not know what time it was, he said. You don't want to speak to me? But she did not answer. I left her lying there and staggered home. He went on to say that they then cycled around aimlessly until he was arrested. I have lost what I loved the most, his statement concluded. She told me she did not love me anymore, but my affection is the same. Crowds several feet deep lined the streets when Kathleen's funeral cortege made its way to Hyde Borough Cemetery on September 15th, and Barber's conviction for murder seemed a foregone conclusion when his trial before Mr. George Lawrence began at Manchester's Assizes on December 14, 1936. He told the court on that evening, Kathleen's death, he had consensual sex with her at Hattersley's Bridge, but she became upset afterwards and began to cry. As they sat on the golf course, he said, she started talking about me going away. She said he did not want me to go away. She said, and eventually I got up and threw my arms around her neck, sobbing, don't leave me. She was a pretty hysterical condition, I said. See, he's completely just trashing a reputation of a girl he murdered here. Typical psychopath, this blank-faced bastard. Typical, like, weasel psychopath type. Trying to blame the murder on the victim. Typical psychopath thing. But she clung more tightly to me as I pushed her away. I'd then risen from my knees to my feet, and during the struggle, as you might call it, she slipped, and of course I fell with her, half across her, and she lay still. I tried to get her to speak, but I was frightened as she lay still. I did not know what had happened, but I knew something was wrong with her. I got my handkerchief and wiped her forehead, and I asked her why she did not speak. Then I got panicky, and I got up and went home in a daze. The jury then heard conflicting medical evidence. Two pathologists said they believed that Kathleen had died from asphyxia and from a shock due to internal injuries suffered during the traumatic rape. A third doctor said she had found no evidence of asphyxiation, but had agreed that the rest of the two pathologists found it. Then a fourth pathologist testified that he too had found no evidence of asphyxiation. He said that he thought that Kathleen's death had been caused by a sudden shock to her nervous system, which could have been triggered by Barber falling on her in the way the defendant had described. That sounds like bullshit to me. The psychologist said that he believed that this shock had stopped Kathleen's heart, a condition known as syncope, from which she would have died within 60 seconds. I've come to the conclusion, the pathologist went on, that it's possible that in this case, the only possible explanation for the girl's death. I say that deliberately after considerable experience of asphyxiation resulting in death. After an hour's retirement, the jury decided to give Barber the benefit of the doubt. They found him guilty of manslaughter and he was jailed for 4 years. Another murder inquiry was launched in Hyde in December 1948. On December 8th, when Gilbert Rothwell was sent to Broadmoor on being convicted of slaying an employee, George Waters, at the Etterstone Hall. Then on February 25th, Michael Kilbride was sentenced to life in imprisonment for the murder of his mother in 24 Shore Avenue in Hyde. Now we're talking about these murders and these killings in a small, tiny place. But the next one I'm going to, even if you live in Timbuktu, you probably heard of this guy. Now, one of the reasons the McCanns, Jerry and Kate McCann, got such an easy ride in the media was this belief that they are doctors and doctors can do no wrong. And this belief that educated people are incapable of being evil, especially in this day and age, since we've had the rise of the educated idiots and their confusion between science and scientism. They have this absolute belief that educated people are all paragons of virtue, incapable of doing any wrong. Uneducated people produce murderers and all the problems in society. Now, you got to sink that in for a second, but that's really how it is today. You just think about that from the McCanns on. Just think about that. And that brings us now to someone I've even mentioned in my own books, like Puzzling People. And this is Hyde's most infamous resident and perhaps the greatest serial killer in the history of the world, Dr. Harold Shipman, who 24 years after the Kilbride's case, the police made a mess of his first investigation. This is probably because he was a doctor and they had this idea he did nothing wrong. The detectives found it impossible to believe that Dr. Harold Shipman, a popular GP, could be a killer. Oh, how, just like the McCanns, how could they have been in any way wrong? How they could never neglect their children? They're doctors. Another doctor had actually blown the whistle, going to the coroner to express her suspicion about the abnormally high mortality rate among Shipman's patients. The inconclusive inquiry enabled Shipman to kill 3 more patients with morphine injection before he was collared. Curiously, Shipman lived in Row Cross Green, Mottram, just a mile from Waterbrook Avenue, where Brady and Moira Hindley had murdered Evan and Leslie Ann Downey. And like the Moors murderers, Shipman behaved almost as if he wanted to be caught. Like Brady and Moira Hindley, he took a stupid risk. Brady and Moira Hindley came unstuck because their vanity led them to show off before Moira's impressionable young brother-in-law, gambling that he would be too scared to go to the coppers and report them. Also, they had made him by making him see Evan's murder. In some ways, they had implicated him as being a witness, and here's the psychopathic part for you. They made the young guy help clean up the body, so that makes him an accessory to the murder. You see how the psychopaths think? This is how cult leaders do the same thing as well. They spread the guilt around so that they control the other party. And that's what happened. And Moira Hindley and Brady's confidence stemmed from the fact that they had been murdered several times and got away with it. You see, each time the psychopath gets the rush, they think they get more of a God complex. They get more and more of a God complex. Same with Shipman. So we had Shipman, who was with the similar arrogance. In June 1998, he crudely forged a £360,000 will of his last victim, Kathleen Grundy, a former mayoress of Hyde. Although he had the actual mayoress of Hyde, the town, he killed her and forged her will. Although he knew her original will had been drawn up by her lawyer's daughter, Angela Woodruff. Inevitably, Mrs. Woodruff called the police. At his trial, Shipman was convicted of the murders of these 15 patients, but subsequent investigation has shown that he slayed at least now 215 women and probably a further 45, making him Britain's most prolific serial killer. A doctor now, a doctor, not a scumbag, not a lowlife, but a respectable general practitioner doctor. It is doubtful if he himself knew the actual total of his tally. He killed so many, they don't even know how many he killed. Hundreds and hundreds. He never admitted his slayings, and his prison suicide in January 2004 denied us whatever he could have told us of his crimes. And he would have loved it. As he killed himself, he would have been smiling, going, they'll never find out. It's power right to the end. Similarly with his death, with With her death in 2002, while serving her life sentence, Moira Hindley took with her whatever secret she had. For a small town like Hyde to have three of the most notorious multiple murderers of the 20th century among its residents is truly remarkable, but no more than an extraordinary coincidence. It could just be one of those things, but one that any town would rather be without. I don't know. I think certain places you have certain psychic storms and psychic intensity brought, and there's a certain like Ian Brady was from Gorbals in Glasgow in Scotland. Now, even though he grew up, we don't know who Ian Brady's father was. And people who've told me that they've seen Brady in court during parole hearings and so on say that he has this air of an aristocrat about them. Now, I did a thing on Ian Brady on one of my videos, and somebody said, how dare you make a point that Brady is evil because he's a working class person who educated himself. That's not why I said he was evil. See, Brady was so obsessed with Joseph Mengele and the Nazis that he fluently learned German so he could feel like Joseph Mengele as hero. He had conversational fluent German at an early age because he was obsessed with Joseph Mengele, who was his hero. It wasn't because he was working class. It was because this person had told me he had this air of aristocrat about him. And we don't know who his real father was. Was his father some kind of aristocrat? And this is the kind of like from Prussia with blood psychosis passed from, psychic psychosis passed from one generation to the next. The Saint's mother, the Duchess. What's that all about? Why does he call her the Duchess? And he has all this power with royalty. There's certain places become flashpoints. It just happens. It just happens. It's almost like in a town, it's like that song by Gene Pitney, A Town Without Pity. In a town that no one cares about, in a town that's like dying and forgotten, it attracts these dark types. You think that no one will care. You'll often find when you have psychopathic killers who kill people for kicks and fun, the police will say to them, why did you kill that kid? Oh, he was a fat kid and we thought no one would give a shit. Or she was an ugly girl and we thought no one would care. In Puzzling People, I mentioned that Hindley had recorded for Brady the sounds of Leslie Ann Downey calling for her mother as she was being slapped and tortured, and Hindley telling her to shut up. The thing was that Brady had made 2 copies of the cassettes, of the tape, the reel-to-reel tape. And when the police asked him why he made 2 copies, he said because it was such an interesting example. So it was almost like he as a psychopathic serial killer, but coming from the same dark psychic infection, maybe perhaps even demonic Gronzon 333 infection, or some kind of jinn infection, or something like that. It was the actual possession of the soul of the child that they killed, Leslie Ann Downey, to the sound of her voice pleading for her mother on a tape recorder, that was more valuable to him and gave him a bigger harvest than the actual killing itself. You see, we're not dealing with human beings here. And also, there were bodies were never found of the Moors murderers that were done by both Hindley and Brady. And this is one of the reasons that she never got out of prison, even though she probably was well eligible for parole. She died in prison. And towards the end, it's clear that she was playing a sexual game with Hindley. By not revealing the murders, it gives Brady power. Sorry, she was playing sexual games, Moira Hindley was, with Ian Brady. And by playing these games, these sex games through the media, it continued to give a sense of sexual and psychopathic excitement, in the same way that when Savile was visiting his old accomplice, Sutcliffe, at Broadmoor Psychiatric Prison, the two of them would go into a room together and staff would report howls of laughter from behind the door. This is because they were sharing like old war stories, like two old soldiers. In their case, it was murdering It was murdering innocent women during the Yorkshire Ripper times. So that's the first hour just about concluded. I hope you found that very interesting. I know these are dark subjects, but they're important too as well, because you don't know the value of society and the worth of humanity unless you look at the shadow of society. And it makes you realize just how much good there is in the world rather than dark. And it's almost like by you discussing these subjects, you learn a lot, because it just the reason why we need to know about psychopaths is to protect ourselves and to shun and isolate them. And what we're doing when I do these shows and do these types of talks is I'm basically giving you a survival manual, because after a while the traits are all the same. Now, majority of psychopaths don't kill, but some do, and it's best you know this. It's best you know this. But it also ties in with the Manchester pusher. It ties in with Savile possibly modelling his whole image on Moira Hindley and so on after her notorious 1966 mugshot. And it just shows what we're up against. But again, no need to be afraid. When you can examine these things from a distance, it becomes a fascinating field of almost psychic or psychoanthropology. And that's one to look out for. Notice the faceless ones. Very interesting. A male who has no facial features. Like you'll see them. I had to deal with a few of them on my Facebook friends list and threw them off. And one of them became literally psychotic, and one of them is an ongoing thing. And they're faceless. There's no features in their faces. It would be almost impossible if they look like a bright light has been shined on their faces, because their kinetic energy is so distorted and so underdeveloped, this kind of primitive psyche inside them, that it's unable to formulate this depth of character within their facial structure. They're just like ventriloquist dummies. Look for people who look like ventriloquist dummies. They're out there. And I'm not saying don't trust them or stay away from them, but be wary of them. Ask yourself why their faces don't have these features. That's the end of the first hour, and I'll see you in hour two. Take care of yourself.